came, eh? I don't even want to know how that sound is being created in actuality. That's just truly horrific.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jacob Kenny.
And I'm Liam McPherson.
It's the newest edition of the Notwithstanding Clauses favorite podcast.
It's
Speech from the Throne, episode 28.
We are here to bring you the latest and greatest from the halls of power.
But not with more constitutional cuddling of workers trying to put some freaking bread on the table. We're just here to argue.
Hey, Jacob, what are we arguing about today?
Well, Liam, about exactly a week ago, there was a debate held, the only debate, in fact, for the Senate seat in Pennsylvania. And I know we don't like to talk about American politics too much because it's horribly depressing, but I think this is important because in this debate, John Fetterman versus Mehmet Oz, that Mehmet Oz, the Dr. Oz, the one that our middle-aged moms have all been getting their dieting and vaccine advice for the last 10 years. He's running for a Senate seat in Pennsylvania. And Fetterman, his opponent, the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania, came down with a stroke in the summer. A stroke whose severity, it seems, was hidden from the public for a long time, and whose severity, though, is now on display in that debate. And it wasn't great for him. It was clear that he was still severely impaired. But the reason why I brought it up is because I think that served as a bit of a Freudian slip. You see, a lot of these Democrats, a lot of these neoliberal politicians, and I would count Justin Trudeau absolutely in that camp, they use a rhetorical flourish to hide a lot of their neoliberal policies. They'll take tax cuts to the wealthy, or they'll take the selling off of Social Security net, and then they'll use some progressive window dressing to make it sound as if it's some sort of, leftist revolution. And Fetterman, when he is in this condition, when he's having active difficulty putting a sentence together, it was clear he couldn't dress up his opinions that way. When he wanted to put a message forward, he could only put the most clear message that he could get. And it was very telling that when he was in this state, he didn't fall back on his supposedly progressive beliefs. He fell back on his neoliberal beliefs. He fell back on his love of fracking rather than, actually caring about ordinary folks. And for his opponent, Mehmet Oz, it was a similar Freudian slip because you had a Republican there that essentially had no active competition in the debate. He was really just speaking directly to the audience with the expectation that Fetterman could not possibly return fire, and so he was able to entirely control the narrative. And so when Mehmet Oz here, when the Republican candidate was talking to the state as a whole, not just his supporters, without any interference, it's very telling what he chose to say. Because it wasn't a mainstream appeal whatsoever. There was one sort of message that Fetterman got out very clearly at the beginning of the debate, and that was whenever Dr. Oz, is on TV, he's lying. And so far as I could tell in that 1-hour debate, that was absolutely the case. With almost every single position that was put forward, it would be a lie or an obscuring. You're talking about abortion rights. It was, I just don't think the federal government should be involved. So he doesn't really say what his position is, but his position is that women shouldn't have an abortion. He just uses a lie to cover it up. Or he'll say, what should we do to combat inflation? Well, if we just tap into our natural resources, we'll grow the economy. Inflation won't matter. Okay, I guess that's economics. Or he says, what about the minimum wage? Well, the minimum wage doesn't matter. It's $7, sure, but if you work hard, you should be able to get a higher minimum. You should get a higher wage anyway, so we don't care about the minimum wage. And that was his response. And then later, when Fox News was covering the debate, they would make shit up. So it's like Fetterman was here. He was clearly disabled. He was clearly in a position where me, as an average voter, I'd feel like I probably shouldn't vote for this guy. But the Fox News crowd, they just couldn't help themselves going a little bit further, just continually adding to the smears and lies. And they were saying like, Fetterman was getting lines fed to him, and the media was telling him what to say. The moderators of that debate started off in painstaking detail explaining that Fetterman was only getting closed captioning. You know what? For people that have actual impairments, like Fetterman, like deaf people, like blind people, this is something we should absolutely be normalizing in the public discourse, is that when you have an impairment and you're running for public office, special conditions are made for people so that, you know, they can still compete on the same level. But instead, of course, Fox has to go into this ableist commentary and like, oh, if he's getting closed captionings, he must be just like the meat puppet of the mainstream media, and we can't trust anyone that has any sort of disability. And so the criticisms were legitimate, but they just can't stay with the legitimate criticisms. They have to show the true evil of their soul. And it's left voters with a really impossible choice. Fetterman's performance was not good. And so if you had a normal Republican, if you had someone who was like, yes, I don't like the government, I want to cut taxes, you know, it make perfect sense. Okay, we can't take the Democrat, we got to take the Republican. But when you have Republicans who are just full of shit and who are backed up by a media network that's even more full of shit, I can understand why Fetterman, a guy that seems like he literally cannot hold the office as in his current state, he still has a very good shot at winning. Because how could you possibly choose Mehmet Oz and this Republican team? You'd rather have someone that can barely hold a sentence together than someone that actually has their brains but is going to use those brains for horrific purposes.
It's a choice between a guy recovering from a stroke and having, you know, difficulties, much of which he can be assisted by and eventually move on from, versus the leopards ate my face party. that's the choice.
Yeah, exactly. And so the question is, how do we avoid ending up in this scenario in Canada? Because this is essentially what we're getting. I mean, Justin Trudeau has had a political stroke, you could say. He is clearly not suited for continuing in the office of Prime Minister. He has worn way too many scandals to continue to be able to ever gain any sort of legitimate, lasting majority. But we're still left in a scenario here where the Conservatives are a worse alternative and the population is kind of split down the middle. They don't like the guy that they want to vote for, and they can't vote for the alternative, and so this just tunes people out. I think just in the Fetterman example and in the Justin Trudeau example, there's a very easy solution here, and that progressives need to step up and start challenging these people rather than leaving. And that's sort of where I'd like to discuss this, because I do bring it up very often, a merger of the NDP and the Liberals. But I think it bears repeating a little bit, and it doesn't have to be necessarily these things, is that progressives or leftists, when you're fed up with these mainstream Democrats or these mainstream liberals, we can't just go and make our own parties. We can't just sit around and talk in our academic circles and scream and write and wish that, you know, the prime minister or the candidates would change. We have to go and contest them. We have to contest them in the primaries. You have to contest them in their constituency nominations. We have to replace them in the current existing party structure, rather than letting these parties that shape so much of the discourse be run by geriatrics politically. We have to fight the fight, and we can't just allow people that are clearly unsuited for office stay in those offices. And so, yes, obviously you have to compromise to win a big tent party. Obviously, sometimes you have to stain yourself a little bit morally. You might have to do deals with people that you don't like. You may have to say things that you don't 100% agree with, but you got to play the game. And I feel like a lot of progressives have just stopped playing the game, that we've sort of given up. We've gone to our own socialist or anarchist or even communist causes on the far reaches of the internet, and we've ceded these mainstream political left-wing, quote-unquote left-wing parties to people that just have absolutely no business running them. And we got to get back into it. We have to actually start playing again, because if we don't, we're going to freaking lose.
Couldn't have said it better myself, man. And so, I mean, just to speak to the U.S.-centric part of it for a moment, the Democrats have had this issue where, and I may have talked about it on the pod before, but not a whole lot. So I'm happy to kind of flesh out my my view on this, and I think you'll agree with a chunk of it. the U.S. Democrats have had this problem where they've been trying to move on from neoliberalism, or factions within the party have been trying to move on from neoliberalism, and other factions that are deeply rooted in neoliberalism. And when I say that, I mean like the sort of 80s, 90s kind of Clintonism in response to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and fiscal restraint and austerity. There's a faction of the Democrats that wants to stay like that, and a faction that wants to change that, constantly tugging back and forth. But the neoliberal section of the party, I would say, still has more control, but they're in their 80s. They're at least in their 70s at least. Most of them are in their 80s, including the two most senior Democrats. And there's nothing, I don't mean to be like overtly ageist or anything like that, but like, come on, you need some renewal. You need some ideas. And there are younger neoliberal Democrats, like there's Pete Buttigieg, but he was completely ineffective because he did what you just mentioned, Jacob, and just to tie it back into your rant, he did what you just mentioned, which was sort of wrap nothing up in progressive words to make it sound like he was doing something.
No, like a Pete Buttigieg who had the same stroke would be saying even less than John Fetterman. Like the guy said nothing. He's just a poet, basically.
Right. And so it's just now voters have to pick between a Democratic Party whose largest faction is asleep at the wheel, while the smaller faction sort of chips away at their influence, but they're not working, as fast as I think anybody would like, or at least they're not having success as fast as anybody would like. So you've got the largest faction, the Democratic Party, asleep at the wheel, and you've got Republicans that have literally become the leopards will eat your face party. So people are like, well, do I vote for these guys that have no idea how to govern or figure it out amongst themselves, let alone pass stuff in the legislature, which is, I'm being a little unfair, but that's might be the average person's view. Or do I vote for the guys that literally fucking hate me, but at least they can get stuff through?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like yes, we can sit and sulk, and we sulk a lot on this program, but we're trying not to anymore. And it's one of the ways that we can stop sulking is to do something, So how do we do that? How do we respond to that? Well, you start playing the game the way that they're playing the game. The Republicans have said that they don't want to govern in good faith.
Yeah.
They don't. They are not going to govern. They are not going to vote. They are not going to act in good faith. They have become the cult of Orange Cheeto Man. They just have. And they're willing to grift on that as far as it gives them electoral success. So if that means being overtly racist, if that means actively working against your interests while purporting to have your back against boogly, boogly, oogly, scary immigrants, then fill your fucking boots. And then you're going to lose any freedoms you had left, But progressives have a role to step in before that happens. And so far we're not. And I think let's workshop that. Like, what are the main reasons that progressives are? And I don't want to say progressives are failing across the board, because there are progressives that have gotten into office at every level. But why are we failing? What is failing here domestically? Because it's very different from the States. Outline the domestic situation for Canadians.
Well, I think the progressive movement failing here is very similar to a problem that progressives have faced, basically, I'd say, since like the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, and that like the main progressive factions just have never been able to agree with one another in the same way that the main conservative factions for some reason have. And maybe it's just because conservatives are more willing to accept authority, and so they're more willing to be mobilized under the authority of a king or a dictator, whereas big personality cults have never worked quite as well in the left. And so in the progressive movement overall, there's always been that split between the black and the red, the anarchists and the communists, or the anarchists and the socialists. And in Canada, it's not quite as extreme, but we have always that split between the Liberals and the NDP, between people who seem to share 80% of their beliefs, but they really can't get over that 20%. And to be quite honest, I think it's much more of that 20%. It lies on the feet of the Liberals to fix, not the NDP. I think the NDP almost always is right on everything. They're just really bad at executing their plans. That's the only criticism I've had for them for a very long time, is their amateurish politics. But the inability to work with one another becomes a major issue. And because we have a first past the post system where they don't need to work together, at least the Liberals don't need to work with the NDP in order to succeed. And in fact, in many ways, the Liberals can use the NDP as like these social outcasts, these left-wing misfits, and they can point to the public and say, yeah, I'm progressive, but I'm not scary socialist like those guys. You can vote for me. And the electoral system has provided the liberals with really, really bad incentives to really ostracize progressive ideas as they appear in the NDP. Whereas the liberals should often be normalizing what the NDP is saying. They should be trying to sell the public and using the vast resources of the liberal war chest to normalize the public on things like universal dental care, like universal pharmacare, to normalize ideas like increased rent control or subsidized housing. The liberals are instead using those resources to scare the public on those things and say, well, we'll like a little bit of them, but I'm queasy about it. I don't, and you'll hear all these stories.
Socialism.
Backbench liberal MPs saying, I don't know, we're getting really left, we're running these deficits. I don't know if I can keep voting for Justin Trudeau, and you know what? Fuck off. You will keep voting for Justin Trudeau. Like, you're an MP. You have no job except to stand up and fucking clap. That's what you're gonna do. Don't, stop writing to the Toronto Star saying that there's gonna be a revolt. There's not gonna be a fucking revolt in the Liberal caucus. If Justin Trudeau came out and said, guys, I'm a Stalinist now, we're having forced collectivization, there's gonna be no freedom of property, we're gonna merge and make a communist utopia, all of the Liberal backbenchers would stand up and applaud him. Absolutely every single one of them. And so there's absolutely...
You're exaggerating, but it's funny.
No, I'm not exaggerating.
You're exaggerating a little bit. I'm sure there would be
100%.
I'm sure there would be 3 or 4 people who would snap out of the 7-year funk that they've been in and be like, "Wait a second, what?" And then the rest would clap. You're close.
Yeah,
you're close.
Their names are all Leona Alislav. They just joined the Tories. But the point is that if the Liberals wanted to, they could use their resources, they could use their rhetoric, they could use the relationship with the media to normalize left-wing ideas. But it's more advantageous for them not to, so they refuse to do it. And that's why progressive politics are failing. And the NDP isn't seeing it. The NDP needs to take over the Liberal Party. They need to join, they need to find a way to force the Liberals to switch to their opinions. And I think they're trying a little bit with this supply arrangement. But you think of the way that Tommy Douglas was able just to really put the screws to Lester B. Pearson, and now something like universal health care, which in the United States is still anathema to a wide portion of the public, in our country, that's considered mainstream. No one would dare challenge it. The Liberals could easily have done that to a wide variety of other issues, but the NDP didn't put enough pressure on them. That's what's necessary here. It's like, you're spending too much time criticizing one another, NDP. You got to spend more time attacking the Liberals and getting them to bend to your will, which you can do, but so long as you're willing to play the game. And that's the difficulty. It's they're not willing to play the game.
And that's the thing, is Republicans, to use the American example for a second again, and it's because it's increasingly happening in Canada, the Republicans aren't working in good faith. They're using procedural tactics to act in bad faith. They've gone to the point where they won't even use procedural tactics. They will actively support a coup to argue in bad faith. It hasn't gotten that far in Canada.
Did you hear about Blake Masters, the candidate in Nevada, supported by Peter Thiel as well? Basically Peter Thiel's main guy. He's on a podcast saying, I want Donald Trump to run again, and when he wins, Donald Trump should fire every single mid-level bureaucrat in the U.S. Federal Service and replace him with quote-unquote our people. And if the Supreme Court doesn't let us do it, we should just ignore the Supreme Court. That's a Republican candidate for Senate in Nevada.
You're not getting the same candidates you got even 5 years ago. You're getting a bunch of people who have no conception of what it means to govern in the country that they live in. And some of that is probably a failing of the system to educate them, and some of that is they're completely bonkers. And the Republican Party is full of people like that. But anyway, getting back to the point I was making, Republicans now are not acting in good faith as legislatures. It's not as bad in Canada, but it's creeping that way. We had conservative members of parliament, some of whom were former ministers, some of whom hold existing high portfolios in the party, including Leader, who supported the convoy when they came in February. And they consider it more of a political win to support the convoy than to not. They're politicians. They're doing it for political reason.
Yeah.
And that's the reason that they're choosing. And it shows us who they are. What's next? Using the notwithstanding clause as a cudgel? Well, that happened with Doug Ford earlier this.
Yep.
And tomorrow, we're recording this Thursday the 3rd, and tomorrow the 4th, 55,000 workers are going to walk off the job because Doug Ford decided to suspend their charter rights using the notwithstanding clause.
And get fined $4,000 a day, maybe.
And to do this, they might get fined $4,000 a day when some of them are already making far below the living wage in where they live. So it's Doug Ford is going after custodians and secretaries because he believes it is more politically beneficial for him to do that, because the mood in the province is, well, our kids had to be out of school a lot because of COVID. We just want to get back to normal. Parents, they're might have sympathy for the union. They might not. They just want to get back to normal. And so Doug Ford is looking at that and he's saying, I think I can score a win. I mean, he's far overplayed his hand, and it could yet backfire on him. It does backfire on him sometimes. That's the thing. But the fact is, he's emboldened to feel like he can get away with it. The Conservatives federally who supported the convoy are emboldened to feel like they can get away with it. And the NDP has kind of made noises in the domain of Pierre Poilievre. They were putting some stuff out last week attacking the governor of the Bank of Canada. They chose that route, and they're talking more about CEOs and affordability and corporate tax and wealthy corporations and monopolies and trigopolies and oligopolies and blah, blah, blah. So they're starting to hit on the right notes. I still don't know if Jagmeet Singh is the right salesman to deliver that message, but it needs to be bolder, and it's hard for the NDP to look bold as a junior partner supporting the government. I mean, personally, as a progressive, I'm happy that they are, because it pushes the possibility of electing Pierre Poilievre off further, but it also pushes off the ability of Justin Trudeau to come to Jesus and reconsider. It gives him more time to do that. I don't think he will. There's some argument to be made, at least electorally, that he's the best person they'll have. Electorally, who's going to get the bump that he did in Quebec? I don't know. But the reality is, we know the NDP probably aren't going to galvanize enough people in enough places to win. If the Liberals collapse, then Poilievre's getting in. That's what's happening. They're not yet at the point of, well, we're going to fill the public service with our people and we're going to ignore the courts. But they're sort of there with the latter, with the notwithstanding clause and using it as a cudgel. Poilievre was defending that in question period. When Trudeau and Poilievre were debating in question period, he was defending that. So we know where he stands on that, and we know he loves to devolve powers to more powers to the provinces, and that he'd love to do that when he gets in, I mean. So, the thing is the NDP is afraid of their own shadow. Liberals are going to liberal. The Liberals are never going to change. They're always going to straddle. Chrétien did the same thing people forget, maybe not to 2015 standards because it was 20 years before, but he had his red book and he campaigned on universal pharmacare and a bunch of super left stuff. The Liberals are going to liberal. Okay? The NDP, for the past 40 years, have been afraid of their own shadow.
Yep.
They need to get somebody in there who comes from either a labor background. It would be great if it was both a cultural and a labor background, somebody who speaks French, somebody who can relate to the common man, who's unabashed. Because the thing is as odious as Poilievre is, as odious as Ford is, to a lesser extent, they're unabashed in the way they operate. You know how they operate. The NDP, it's not that Jagmeet, we don't know how he operates, it's that we've seen how he operates, and he ain't it. He ain't unabashed in the sense of, he did have a tough upbringing at first. At one point, he did have to care for his sibling, and he was poorer. I think sometimes when people see his nice cars and watches, I think conservative trolls on Twitter and so other social media sometimes make hay out of that and go, look, he's saying he's for the common man, but here he is with this nice watch, and here's his wife in this really expensive dress, and blah, 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 blah. And they make fun of him for it, and I'm not saying that's justified, but I think he's a continuation of a party that's afraid of its own shadow. That has nothing to do with how he chooses to dress or how he chooses to style himself, and more who he chooses to surround himself with. The NDP have had the same group of central strategists for a decade now. The same people, both in Ontario and both federally, and that's a problem. Clean house, get somebody in there who wants to reconnect with labor. I think that's a big issue. I like Jagmeet a lot. I think he's good at humanizing some things. I don't know if he can take them all the way. I don't know. I could be proved wrong, but there's no firebrand. You've often said the left needs a firebrand. I think that's the obvious solution, a firebrand with a good, strong team.
A firebrand would be nice. It definitely would be great. Like a good old Luc Mélenchon or someone like that would be fantastic. But as I see in the experience in Alberta, you don't necessarily need a left-wing firebrand. I wouldn't call Rachel Notley even remotely a firebrand person, but just scooping up basically the failures of the past Liberal Party in Alberta, and the PCers that were angry at the current Conservative coalition. She's easily leading in the polls. She's like almost at 50% in the polls in Alberta, which is amazing for the NDP. That just comes from a consolidation. This is not good for the country, but what the NDP needs to do is they need to start gambling with the future of this nation a little bit and start putting the screws to the government. Because at the end of the day, if the Liberals do completely fall apart and Pierre Poilievre becomes the next prime minister, it's only upside for the NDP. The NDP need to wait for the Liberals to destroy themselves and then sit in the wings and scoop them up. And they're so bad at putting them in a position to actually do that. I've seen it happen with my own two eyes in the province in which I grew up, so I know that it's possible, and it's crazy to me that they refuse to position themselves to do it. And so the question is, how do you position yourself to do it? Well, I think there's one blindingly obvious solution to this inflation crisis, and that is a universal basic income. And then you can talk about funding it, through some sort of wealth tax. But if you are the NDP and you're putting a universal basic income and you make that public, you're like, okay, we're changing the deals of our arrangement here. We expect the Liberal government will announce a universal basic income, or we will withdraw our support. And then if the government falls and you run an election on that, you can win an election on that. It's going to be tough. But if you keep to that talking point and you sell it as hard as you possibly can, and you don't do the NDP thing of bringing up a billion other things on the side, you just say, universal basic income, you're starving now, I'm going to feed you. That's your only line. You say that to everyone. You can definitely win an election on that. And it always polls well, that issue by itself. The NDP, I don't know what they're doing. They're trying to be more realistic by saying, oh, we'll have dental care for a few of these groups and we'll have universal pharmacare for a few of these groups. But you know what? No one gives a shit. No one thinks that the NDP is going to be realistic. No one votes for the NDP assuming that their platforms are all costed out and they're going to be the economics masters. No one has ever thought that that's going to be the NDP's strength. You vote for the NDP because they're morally the superior choice. They got to lean on that brand. Right now, we have some real big issues that they can solve. Their policies can actually help solve the problems that we have. So, you know what? If Parliament falls, Parliament falls. And to be totally fair, that's probably not what would happen. The NDP would submit this proposal, and then the Liberals would say, yeah, you know what, whatever, we're going to talk to the Bloc instead, and we're going to give whatever the Bloc wants, and we're going to keep in a supply arrangement with them. But you know what? That's a way better spot when you put out your position, you say what you stand for, and then you can fight that in the next election, versus these really mealy-mouthed promises that they've barely extracted from the Liberals. And it seems like we'll see what Chrystia Freeland's mini update is. It looks to me like Freeland is saying that she's not going to pay for these programs that the NDP have asked for anyways. I mean, she said very clearly to her ministers, don't bring up any new spending unless it's going to be funded by cuts. Well, the dental program and the pharmacare program are both new programs, so it seems to me that in the directions that Freeland's already given to ministers, she's planning on fucking over the NDP. So it's time for the NDP to screw them back.
I agree with part of what you said. I think there's nuances around the way you have to present basic income, unfortunately, because it's been wrongfully framed as just more welfare for people to sit at home and do nothing. That's unfortunately a very powerful frame. And you don't want to play directly into that frame necessarily, but there's a way that you can avoid the frame while also tying it to another issue. And I've mentioned before, like marketing it as a data dividend, which could also pick up conservative-minded people who don't like their data being used for whoever the heck by some third party. Frame around it. But frame around it doesn't mean promise a balanced budget while Justin Trudeau's promising to spend a little bit and also do these 30 transformative things. Being afraid of your own, framing around it doesn't mean, we're going to introduce dental, but only for kids under 12, right? It's important progress. I'm not saying it's not important progress, and it's incremental, and that's fine. But incremental things never benefit a junior partner. They just don't. Medicare, I know we owe it as much to Tommy Douglas as to Pearson, but Pearson gets the credit. He does. The end. Nobody's put the NDP in government, even though they helped give us the most important system, or one of the most important systems we have. So, I think they're going to get some press. Don't get me wrong. I think they're going to get some positive press, but it's not going to get them to 24 Sussex or the cottage or wherever the Prime Minister lives now, or a ditch, on the grounds of Rideau Hall. I have no idea where he is these days. That's the thing is, like, I think it's normal to be afraid of getting framed in on an issue, but when you wear that so much that it clouds your ability to recognize your own shadow, then you're in trouble. And that's where they're at. They're still talking more and more progressive. They're still fundamentally neoliberal, urban, and well-educated, which all of which, not all of those things are bad, but you need to diversify your party.
So we're talking about the NDP here?
I'm talking about the NDP, yeah. The NDP is incredibly urbanized and well-educated, which is fine, but you've lost touch with the rural working class roots that you once had, and those people are about to elect a fascist light.
And that's also the reason why they're not willing to play hardball with the current government in the way that I've recommended, because they are deeply afraid of losing seats to the Conservatives in the same way that the NDP lost a shit ton of seats around Hamilton and Southern Ontario to Doug Ford in the last provincial election here in Ontario. Those union towns are fleeing the NDP and going to the Conservatives because they don't have a convincing cultural message for those workers. And rather than competing in new territory, or rather than moderating their cultural message to keep those workers on side, they're not picking a side.
The Saskatchewan NDP wouldn't let Jagmeet Singh come speak at their
and
event.
Alberta too. And there's a reason for that. Like, he's a weakness for them. Like, Alberta, they realized what's happened is that the NDP has essentially taken over the spot that the Liberal Party would have, and they're actively going after, like, old PC voters in Alberta now. It's still an NDP. It's still a New Democratic Party, and it's still led by people who are fundamentally socialist. But they know they have to change their messaging a little bit if they're going to be that progressive alternative.
Yes,
and that's like. Yeah.
Yes, but here's the thing, though. There's just a brief interjection, because there's nuances depending on the political situation, right? Like, so you just mentioned the NDP's success in Alberta and pivoting their brand, and I think they owe as much to Jason Kenney collapsing as they do to their pivots. And I mean, they've been given a rare opportunity in that she's already served as premier. She has an opportunity to have a second outing as premier and learn from her previous mistakes. So I think that's intriguing, especially for a woman politician. But I digress. Ontario has a very similar situation brewing, where the Ontario Liberals have completely collapsed as an electoral machine. They have completely collapsed for the first time in decades. They're just completely kaput. The Ontario NDP, they've turfed Andrea Horwath after 13 long years. They're going to put a new leader in. They have a chance to reconnect with Labour. So the thing is they have a chance to reconnect with Labour, but they also have a chance to fill the void that the Liberals left, which is key. Not to say that Notley's pivot was easy, not to say that the Ontario NDP's potential, becoming the main left-wing party will be easy. I'm not saying any of that's easy, but the trouble with the Orange guys is they need to stop being groundhogs and stop being afraid of their own shadow and just own it, but also, like, tweak your messaging in such a way that, like people by and large agree with your values. It's how you say it and how you market it.
Yeah, I think the situation in Ontario is actually very indicative of what's happening and what I was describing in the beginning of my rant, where you had Andrea Horwath that, yes, it's necessary for her to step down, but she fled provincial politics. I mean, she went to become the mayor of Hamilton and brought her whole team with her. Those are resources that could have been very well utilized in building the party and using her brand and her people to reinforce the party's position relative to the Liberals, so that gets
you want her people gone. You want all of her people out. I vehemently disagree with that.
You can't just remove all the infrastructure overnight and then expect that they're going to be in a good position to win.
Party,
you have to change.
I disagree. That party needed to be burnt
down.
down.
But you can't get rid of the resources. You need those. You need all.
What do you mean Trudeau burnt down the leadership and the resources of the previous Liberal Party and rebuilt it in his own?
Trudeau brought a new team with him that he'd been building for a long time.
Well, sure,
who's
but
who's
he brought
this
a team
NDP
and
person that he's like? You could see with the BC NDP, like, if that environmentalist lady had won. She clearly had a massive fundraising arm and a massive group of organizers. She could have taken over, but I don't really see a similar...
You gotta have a team. You gotta have a team in waiting, but that was the problem with the Ontario NDP, is there was no fucking team in waiting. It was the same goddamn team for 13 years, and that was their problem. That's why you need to burn it down. Obviously, if you burn it down, you need to replace it with something. I'm not saying burn it all down and run it by herself. But you need to, when a party is that deep in a leadership crisis where you've had the same leader for that long, it'll become their party unless you take action to stop that. And the only way to do that is to burn it down. When one person's been leader of the party for that long, it's the same problem that the Greens are having structurally. It's the same issue that the Liberals had to some extent before Trudeau.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say at the Greens because, like, Elizabeth May's in relation to the Green Party, like Elizabeth May's personal brand is probably equal in size and importance to the Green Party.
More.
Whereas, like, Andrea Horwath is super important in the NDP, but the NDP brand is stronger than just Andrea Horwath. Like, I just don't think the same risks exist in the NDP for it to become a cult of personality to Horwath if she sticks around. I think she could have been very helpful.
I mean, it's not that, like, there aren't moments that you want to call her up and say, hey, what do you do in this kind of situation or whatever. Like, I know that Trudeau's drew on past prime ministers, including Brian Mulroney, at times. Like, what did you do and how, like, how should I handle it? Like, it's happened across party lines. So it's not to say that there can't be some sort of questions in that regard, but I think as far as the team around the next leader of the Ontario NDP, it's imperative that they have a completely different team, an experienced team nonetheless. But you don't want to have any old ties to the inner circle of the previous leader. That's ridiculous.
You need new staffers, but when it comes to lists of donors and lists of volunteers and the infrastructure,
sorry, I'm not talking about that.
Horwath just stole the party infrastructure that she'd been building in the NDP, and she just moved it from Toronto to Hamilton to win a mayoral race. And it's like the NDP was in a great position to take over the Liberals, and I think she essentially hamstrung it with her own ego.
No, I think you see her as far more valuable than she is. Nobody ever wanted her to be premier. They just didn't.
Man,
they just didn't want her to be premier.
Anyone that consistently win the party leadership of a party that's of a reasonable size, like the Ontario NDP, is someone that has
means you own the party.
They have an effective political machine that needs to be respected, and it can be put to good use.
But she had 13 years to try. She didn't win.
Yeah.
So
she can't. She can't be the leader, but she could have been a good member of a team of a new leader. Like, she could have been a good lieutenant, or she could have been someone to. And this is what I mean in general. It's like us progressives have a tendency of pushing people away because we don't like their politics, and like we need someone that can build alliances. We need to be expanding the size of our team. So I do agree that leadership needs to change entirely, and that's what I started the rant about. But You have to be able to hold what we have and grow it. Because like what we have right now is too small to win. We need to grow it. It's not just a question of changing who's at the top, but we actually got to find a way to preserve what we're building and change the people in the top. And that's much more challenging. It requires a high level of talent from the existing leadership.
Sure, but you can't just keep Andrea Horwath's field manager in because you're too lazy to find another way to actually win the premier's office instead of using the same failed electoral map. You can build off of the old electoral map, but if you're using it, like, you can build off of some of the same voter coalitions, but you do have to be careful with that too, especially if you're going to completely change the way that you market yourself and word yourself, which they should also do, because that might appeal to different people, and then you might find you have new voter coalitions. So there are some traditional bases of support. Like, I'm not saying that when Trudeau goes, the Liberals should just stop trying to win on the island of Montreal. Like, I'm not saying any of that. What I'm saying is the reason that parties fail in successive campaigns with the same leader is because they're not up to the task, and sometimes defeats are out of the control, sometimes they're in their control. But the reality is, if you've been there for over a decade and you've not won at all, there's no reason for you to be there. There just isn't. So I meant more from like a leadership perspective. I didn't mean like, let's burn down every part of the old leadership that could benefit us for the sake of burning it down. It's like, no, let's burn down all of the remnants of the failing previous inner circle and leader.
Yeah, I just think that you and I have very different ideas of what the political project is. For me, a political party should always be in the situation where if there's a revolution, or if there's no idea as to who the legitimate government is, a good political party should always be placed so that you can walk in to, the parliament, you can walk into the houses of power and say, we're the government now. A political party should always, at any time, be able to take over the reins of power if it sees an opportunity to do so. Now, in a democratic state, we all trust that isn't going to happen and that there isn't going to be this vacuum of power. And so I think we've sort of been lazy. We only build parties that are meant to win elections. But the idea of what a political party is supposed to be is that it's a sort of ancillary state, or it's parallel state. It's a place where you have all your policy experts. You're offering services to your members. You're having discussions on a legal and philosophical nature to know how men are supposed to be governed in their affairs. And so that when you do have the opportunity to take power, you know what you're going to do with it, and you already have exercised your own bureaucratic structures, so you know how to divide that power efficiently and effectively. And that requires building. It requires decades and decades of work that you have to build around. You have to get a bigger and bigger team and bigger resources. And so I think one of the reasons why our leadership is so ineffective in this day and age is that we've moved away from that model. We're only talking about one thing, and that's winning elections, whereas the older model of political parties, the political parties that we all had when we started out as countries, followed these models. They had people that knew what they would do when they gained power, whereas now we just have a bunch of people whose only thought in their mind is, how do I win power to begin with? And there's no one thinking about, how do we actually exercise power when we win. That's more what I'm talking about. It's functioning. It's an organization. It's knowing who your people are, and then getting a good bureaucratic structure to organize them, to make them feel like they're participating in the party, that they have a voice in the party, that they're actively engaged, and that they have something to do. You got to have some sort of command and control structure. You often have to deliver services. Like the Muslim Brotherhood is a classic example in the Arab world, where they offer medical services. They offer even education in some countries. Like, the realm of what a political party can do is really neutered in the Western world. We have a very, very small idea of what a political party is. But again, a political party should always be able to take over government at any time. Whenever there's a vacuum of power, a good political party should be able to step in. And if you're not in that position, you have work to do. And that's what I mean by saying, you can't just get rid of all of Andrew Horvath's people. It's like, when you've been building this bureaucracy, when you've been building this organization, you have to find a way to integrate it into the structure as it grows. You need to be always expanding your bureaucratic structure so that when you're offered the opportunity to govern, you can actually responsibly take it up. And if you're constantly burning it down every time you have a new leader, yes, you might be able to win an election, but you won't be able to do anything, because you're not going to have anyone that actually knows how to use power. And that's often more important than learning how to win it.
And one day, the party will become the country.
Yeah.
And one day, the country will become the party.
The whole CCP claps.
And one day... And on this note, we'd like to send you off to the exits thinking about all that, and hope you enjoyed the discussion. If you want to send us your thoughts, shout out to us. It's speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. That's speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. All one word, lowercase, very easy. And until then, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you in the next one.
Bye.